How important was cinema to child Bill? Was it something of a lifeline for him?
I think, well, many films were still black and white in those days, but Technicolor was on its way in. And I've heard Bill say in the past it was the only colour in his life.
Can you remember your first ever meeting with Bill Douglas?
It was in Billet 89 at RAF Aberystwyth in the Suez Canal zone. And I was there before Bill was. He was transferred in from another camp somewhere in Egypt. And he was further down the billet from me. I was in the corner, which you see in the film, actually.
And what were your first impressions of Bill?
Well, we were both 18, which was a very young age in those days. And he looked very young for his age. And he was quite shy in those days. And a little bit pigeon-chested. I don't know what that means. And he just had a black and white check shirt, which he wore all the time. But yeah, we gradually got to know each other. Mainly, he approached me. Somebody wrote that his first words to me were asking for a fill of ink. That may have been true, actually. We all used phantom pens in those days, with biros. I don't think had come in. I'm talking about 1953, coronation year.
But was the real life Bill anything like the Jamie in My Way Home? Was he a character that needed egging on a lot? Because obviously Robert has to kind of urge Jamie to do things in My Way Home. Yeah. Is that how it happened with you and Bill?
He was full of self-pity at that age. And because he discovered that I was an ear who would sort of sit and listen to him, he would pour out all these stories about his terrible childhood. And I wish now I could remember more detail. But after I'd heard about this 2 or 3 times, I got incredibly bored and I wished he'd shut up and go away, I don't know if that comes through a little bit in the films. And as we got to know each other more, I think I was able to tease him out of it in a way. But the point about our friendship was that I'm obviously from a totally different background than Bill, and he had decided at some point, and I don't know how or when, that the world of the arts had something for him that he wanted to know about and he wanted to sort of get into. And I guess I was almost the only person in the billet who had any interest in the arts. I mean, all the other, we're talking about national servicemen, 18 years old, sprogs we used to be called. And most of them were only interested in, I think, getting hold of a cockroach and setting it alight, that sort of activity which you see in the film. Whereas I was a weird outsider because I had these photographs of people like T.S. Eliot and John Masefield, who was the poet laureate then, and composers like Sibelius up on as pin-ups. Whereas all the other national servicemen obviously had real pin-ups. So something about this decided Bill that he would like to get to know me better.
What were Bill's cinema influences or film favourites at that time?
Well, in the film, Jamie has pin-ups of Marilyn Monroe, right? And of course, that was the year of Niagara, which you see in the film. And I'm sure we did see Niagara. To my taste, I hated it. I thought it was vulgar. We saw other films at that time, Roman Holiday, which has a quality charm which is almost entirely absent from today's films. And a funny little film called Red Garters, I remember, which nobody's ever heard of. It was a sort of Hollywood Western musical, but it was in very weird colours. It was quite experimental. But what I was going to say is that on his locker, Bill actually didn't have Marilyn Monroe in real life. He had Doris Day. She was his big favourite. And 53, I think, was the year of Calamity Jane. So that was Bill's influence at that time.
Did you realise that there was something special about this friendship which would last?
I still remember to this day, sitting on a seat with him out in the boiling sunshine surrounded by sand. And it suddenly crossed my mind like a flash that if I was going to be friends with this chap, it was going to be for life. That suddenly crossed my mind. And that's what happened. I suppose because of his background, I knew that, he'd suffered rejections, and I knew that if he was going to come to rely on me some way, I couldn't let him down. I couldn't walk away from him,
During the 60s, when he's first of all studying to be an actor and then applies himself to writing, was he as focused and as burning with ambition then as he was when he was actually a director on set?
Well, the important thing about the 60s is that we were seeing great cinema. Where we lived, we were in close proximity. Our two local cinemas were the Academy in Oxford Street and the Cameo Poly just north of Oxford Circus. And they were the two cinemas in London that showed your Truffaut, your Bergman, your Antonioni, as I still think, the great masters of European and world cinema. And Bill began to understand, I guess, that you could actually write and direct your own film, which wasn't something that was common in America or Britain at that time. So he began to write an autobiographical script. Actually the first version that he wrote was called Jimmy, because he wrote these two characters who met in later life as he gave them different names. He gave himself a different name, I suppose, to be able to distance. And also he was a little bit shy. He didn't want to admit that it was autobiographical until Lindsay Anderson read the script, which was before Bill went to film school, sort of 68, I guess, 67 or 68. Bill decided to contact one or two people in the British cinema who we did admire. Clive Donner was, oddly enough, the first. He'd made a little film that's forgotten today called Some People, which seemed to us to have a particular freshness about it. And Bill sent him a script, which he promptly lost, and we've never seen again, sadly. But then he looked up Lindsay's phone number in the book, and Lindsay was in the London telephone directory. He sent him a card and they met. Lindsay used to tell this story quite frequently if he was ever interviewed on radio or television. They met in a coffee bar in Old Compton Street, and he was the guy who said to Bill, "This is autobiographical," which didn't take a lot of insight to realise. And Bill very abashedly said, yes, it is, So one of the things that Lindsay said to him is, well, why don't you own up to this and call the film My Childhood?
Now, how important was Mamoon Hassan to Bill making it as a director?
He set up the process whereby My Childhood was made on a budget of £4,000. And Mamoon was also responsible for the one film becoming 3 films, becoming a trilogy.
There are stories of Bill being difficult at times on the set during the trilogy. How true are those stories?
Well, I'm sure they were true. Bill said himself I could be difficult. But I think it was because Bill had a passion. He knew what he wanted to make. I mean, it was personal cinema. He already had the film in his head. And if he couldn't get on camera, on screen, what he had in his head, he was a bit distraught. And of course things go wrong. So yes, I think he probably threw his typewriter out of a window at one point in time. He also snatched the film away at the editing stage and the police had to be called. Yeah, they were good times.
Now, in the last part of the trilogy, My Way Home, the second half of that is a representation of the beginning of your friendship with Bill. How true is that a representation of what actually happened?
The story that you see, the friendship between Jamie and Robert, hardly anything that happens actually happened as it is shown in the film. I can only think of about one thing that actually happened, which I only know about because we still have the snaps, which was the photographs that we were taking one day. and Bill dressed up in an Egyptian costume and actually grinned broadly, which in the film you feel is almost the first time that Jamie ever smiled. We also played around in the sand, like you see, sort of having a bit of a struggle where Robert shouts out, "He is alive, he is alive." That's me teasing Bill. I mean, that's the sort of thing that probably transpired. Bill had always said that he wanted the film to have a happy ending, the trilogy, because the first two parts don't have a particularly happy ending. They leave the audience hanging on a string, as it were. So it was deliberate that he wanted our friendship, I suppose. Now, what Bill would say is, when he was interviewed, he would say, "I am," meaning himself, "I am the happy ending." The fact that he became Bill Douglas out of this funny little character called Jamie, who had such a bad start in life, he became Bill Douglas. And when I think about it now, you know, going back over those 50 years, it is an extraordinary journey from his background that he was able to achieve so much artistically, although he's not widely known in terms of cinema history. I'm very proud of what he achieved.
What drove Bill Douglas then? Obviously, you know, there's always talk about focus and getting this vision out. What was he hoping to achieve by that?
I think that many famous artists in whatever field, composers, painters, writers, a lot of them, if you think about it, came from fairly poor beginnings, maybe had a difficult childhood. And I'm sure the urge to make your mark, if you like, on posterity, it may well have something to do with that. And personally speaking, I mean, I can say this because it doesn't apply to me, I think the world of the arts, is the greatest immortality. I think people are remembered down the centuries if they've produced something beautiful, to be seen, to be heard, in whatever field of the arts. To me, that is the greatest immortality, whereas lots of other people, including politicians, are very easily forgotten, although they seem to be very important at the time. But myself, I think Bill made the right choice. He wanted to become an artist. He actually says that in one part of the trilogy. And he did become an artist. And I believe a very great artist. And it's just a tremendous privilege for me to have lived through a part of that experience, to have been in some way or another an enabler. And when I look back on his life now, I mean, I miss him terribly.